The stallion had gone over backward in the chute, and now it was killing itself, and 4 grown men stood along the rails with their ropes slack in their hands, watching. It was the biggest horse on the Doran place, a Blood Bay stud colt named Cinder that was supposed to anchor next spring's sail string, and it had caught a hind leg between 2 cottonwood rails and panicked the way only 1,000 pounds of muscle can panic. Each lunge drove the splintered wood deeper. Blood was already darkening the trampled snow. The men knew that a horse in that state would break its own neck before it would let a person near, and so they did the only sensible thing, which was nothing, and they called for ropes, and the ropes did nothing either. Every man held back. Every man but her. Della Fenn came across the yard at a heavy walk, not a run, because she had learned long ago that running told an animal there was something worth being afraid of. She was 23 years old and built wide and low to the ground, the kind of plane that men's eyes passed over without snagging. And she had a sack of clean rags over one shoulder, and her father's voice somewhere down in her chest, saying, "Slow hands, slow heart." She climbed the rails. The foreman shouted at her to get back. She did not get back. She put her broad palm flat against the bay's heaving shoulder, and she began, very low, to hum. It was an ugly little tune with no name. The horse's ear came around. She kept humming, and she worked her hand down the lather of its neck while it shuddered and stood, and when its breathing dropped from a scream to a bellows, she knelt right there in the bloody snow beside a leg that could have caved her skull, and she eased the splintered rail free a half-inch at a time. The colt let her. Nobody afterward could say why. By the time Caleb Doran came out of the barn at a dead run, the horse was standing free and trembling, and Della Fenn was binding the gash above its hock with strips of her own apron, talking to it the whole while in that low voice, as if the two of them were old acquaintances who had simply met again. If her story moves you, and it will, before it is through, stay to the end of it, and leave the name of your town down below, so that it can be known how far a thing like this travels. The notice that had brought her to Antelope Bench was tacked to the wall of the freight office in Cottonwood Forks, Montana, in the autumn of 1893, and it had asked for a woman of strong constitution, willing to cook and keep a house, and turn her hand to ranch work as required. No letters of character necessary. That last part was what had decided her. Della Fenn had no letters of character. She had buried her father 2 years back outside Miles City, a horse trader who had taught her everything he knew and left her nothing else. And since then, she had moved from one outfit to the next, the way weather moves, wanted while the work was hard and forgotten when it eased. She had $3 and a carpet bag, and a body the world had decided was a verdict against her. She read the notice twice and took it down off the wall, and the clerk watched her do it and said not one word. The wagon ride out took half a day behind a deaf old freighter named Whit, who chewed and spat and did not speak until they had forded the second creek, and then he looked sideways at her bulk on the seat and asked if she knew what she was riding toward. She said she knew it was a ranch that needed a cook. He laughed without any humor in it. The Doran place, he told her, had run 900 head of fine saddle stock 3 years gone, and now it was down to under 300, and half of those were going lean for want of grass. Caleb Doran had lost his wife 2 winters back, lost the baby with her, and lost something else besides that didn't have a name but showed in his face. 2 hands had drawn their pay and gone to the railroad in the spring. The last cook had quit inside a month. Della asked why. Whit spat. "Because Caleb Doran is a hard man to please," he said, "and a harder one to read." She said she did not need him easy. Whit looked at her a long moment, and then he turned back to his mules, and he said, low, "No, I don't reckon you do." She smelled the place before she saw it wood smoke and horse and the particular sourness of a spring gone bad. When the wagon topped the bench, the whole of it lay open below. A long log house with a sagging porch, a barn that needed shingling, pole corrals, and beyond them, a brown sweep of grass burned to nothing by a drought that had not broken since June. 3 men were forking the last of a thin haystack. The fourth, taller, stood apart with his arms crossed, watching a creek that had stopped running. That was Caleb Doran. She knew it the way you know weather coming. He did not help her down, and she did not wait to be helped. She came off the wheel hub heavier than she meant to, and felt the old hot shame go through her when she landed. And she shut it off the way she had taught herself, the way you bank a stove. She straightened her dress and looked up at him. He was lean and dark and unshaven, with eyes the gray of old fence wire and about as warm. And he looked at her the way she had been looked at in 100 towns, except that his gaze never once dropped below her chin. He looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he isn't sure will hold. "You're the one who answered," he said. She said she was. "You cook." She said she could cook a roundup crew under the table and keep books. Besides, that her father had run a trading string, and she'd kept his ledgers since she was 12. He took that in, without expression. "I need a cook," he said, "not a clerk." She said he could decide later what he needed. Something flickered behind the fence wire eyes, gone before it landed, and he told her supper was at sundown, and there were 8 to feed. She fed 9 of them by dark, and she fed them well, and the kitchen, which had not smelled of anything but burnt coffee in months, filled up with the smell of dried apple pie made from a barrel nobody else had thought to open. The young hand, a 16-year-old named Toby with a stammer and a cowlick, ate 4 pieces. The foreman, a leathery cuss called Bartlett, said nothing, but came back for thirds. Caleb Doran ate in silence at the head of the table, and at the end of it, he looked at her across the lamplight and said, "That'll do." 2 words. From him, she would learn. 2 words were a sermon. In the weeks that followed, she did the thing she had always done, which was to make herself necessary so quietly that nobody noticed it happening. She cooked. She doctored a foundered gelding back to soundness with a poultice and a change of feed when Bartlett had been ready to shoot it. And one rainy afternoon, finding the ranch ledger open on Doran's desk while she swept, she could not help herself. She ran the columns. The columns did not balance. They had not balanced in a long while, and not because of the drought. Money was leaving the Doran account in small, careful bites, a charge for hauling that had never happened, a tax assessment paid twice, a feed bill from a Cottonwood Forks store the ranch had never traded at. Somebody in town was bleeding the place $1 at a time, and trusting that a grieving man would never look close. She wrote it all out in her own neat hand on the back of a flour sack and left it on his desk and said nothing. He found it that night. She heard the office door, then a long quiet, then her name. When she came, he had the flour sack flat under the lamp, and his jaw was set hard. "Where'd you learn to read a ledger like this?" he said. She told him again about her father. He looked at the figures, and then he looked at her, and for the first time, the fence wire eyes had something live in them. "Who's doing it?" he said. She said she didn't know yet, but the feed bill carried the name of Asa Pruitt's Mercantile, and Asa Pruitt was the brother-in-law of a man she'd been hearing about since she got off the wagon. A man named Hollis Vane. Hollis Vane came calling himself 2 days later, in a glossy black buggy behind a matched pair, and he came smiling. He was a big, soft, handsome man in a town suit with a watch chain heavy as a trace, and he shook Caleb Doran's hand and admired the horses and said how sorry he'd been, truly, to hear of Sarah's passing, and all the while his eyes went over the ranch the way a butcher's go over a steer. He had come, he said, to make a neighborly offer. The drought was no friend to anybody. A man could break his heart on grass that wouldn't grow. Vane was prepared to take the worry off Doran's hands at a fair price, cash money, and let him walk away clean. Caleb Doran said the place was not for sale. Vane's smile did not move, but something behind it cooled by 10 degrees, the smile of a man who writes a thing in a book to be settled later. He tipped his hat to Della on the porch, ma'am, without really seeing her, climbed back into his buggy, and drove out at the same lazy pace he'd come, and that ease was its own kind of threat. She watched the dust of him go, and felt the back of her neck prickle, because a man does not come smiling for ground he believes is dying. It got worse fast after that, in the careful, deniable way that bad things get worse when a clever man is behind them. The fouled spring near the house turned out to be fouled on purpose. She found the carcass of a poisoned coyote dragged up into the seep where it would rot into the water, and the drag marks led to shod hoofprints that did not belong to any horse on the place. A mile of wire on the north line was cut clean, and 40 head drifted off into the breaks before they were missed. Toby found the prize bay colt, the one Della had saved at the chute, standing 3-legged in the home pasture with a farrier's nail driven up into the frog of its good hoof. Deliberate, the kind of cruelty that takes a steady hand, the boy cried. Caleb Doran did not cry. He stood over the lamed horse with his hat off and his face gone to stone, and Della understood that this was a man learning, all at once, that the slow bad luck he'd been blaming on God and weather had a name and a watch chain. He wanted to ride into Cottonwood Forks and call Vane out in the street. She talked him down at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "You go in angry," she said, "and you give him exactly what he wants. A wild, grieving man who shot first. Then it's you in the territorial dock and him weeping at your funeral." She kept her voice level. "We don't fight him with our fists, we fight him with paper. You go to the sheriff and you swear out a report on every bit of it. The spring, the wire, the horse, not because the sheriff will lift a finger, but because you need it written down, dated, in the record. Because this is going to come down to who can prove what." He looked at her across the light and said, "You think like a lawyer." She said, "I think like somebody who already lost everything once, for being too honest to be careful. My father trusted the wrong note in the wrong man's hand. I watched the bank take the only home I ever had while he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands." Something moved in Caleb Doran's face then, that was not pity, which she could not have borne, but recognition. One wounded creature, seeing the shape of the wound in another. "All right," he said. "We do it your way." And then, after a moment, lower. "Don't go alone." The sheriff in Cottonwood Forks took the report and wrote it all down with great show and did nothing, because the sheriff and Hollis Vane sat in the same church pew, and everybody in 3 counties knew it. But the report existed. It was dated. Della had learned long ago that a useless thing kept carefully can become a sharp thing later. What she needed now was to understand why. A man like Vane did not poison springs over a drought-killed horse ranch unless that ranch was worth far more than it looked, and so the next time Whit hauled supplies to town, Della rode along in her plainest dress with a real and boring list: coffee, soda, lamp oil, a paper of needles, and she let herself become what she had always been to such places: invisible. Pruitt's Mercantile was the kind of store where the whole county's talk pooled like rainwater, finding the low spot, and she stood at the dry goods shelf, taking her slow time over thread, and she listened. It did not take long. The talk was all of the railroad, the spur line coming up from the south, the surveyors who'd been seen running their chains along Antelope Creek, the fortune that would fall on whatever water stop the company chose, because in a country that ran dry by July, the railroad would build its tanks and its town wherever a man could promise it year-round water. "And there ain't year-round water for 40 Mile, said a woman by the flour bin with great authority, "excepting maybe up in that bad coulee on the old Doran Range, and Doran don't even know what he's sitting on." Behind the counter, Asa Pruitt told her to hush. Della bought her thread and said nothing, and rode home with her heart going hard, because she had it now, the whole shape of it. Vane wasn't trying to buy a dying ranch. He was trying to steal the ground the railroad would pay a king's ransom for, and steal it cheap, before a grieving man ever learned it was a kingdom. But the woman by the flour bin had said that Bad Coulee and Della Fenn had never in 2 months heard anyone on the Doran place speak of any coulee with water in it at all. She went looking the next morning before light, on the deaf old mule, with her father's eye for ground. The hands had told her the northeast corner was worthless, a brushy, snake-ridden gash in the benchland called Rattlesnake Coulee, where 2 horses had broken legs and nobody bothered to ride. She rode it anyway, slow, reading the land the way her father had taught her to read it, not with the eyes, but with the whole body. The way the grass stayed green in a seam down the bottom when everything around it had gone to straw. The way the swallows cut low over one bend of the dry wash, the cottonwoods that had no business being alive in a 4-month drought, standing dark and full along 100 yards of stream bed. Water did not let go of cottonwoods. She got down, she walked the seam, and up under a shelf of red rock where a rockfall had choked the old channel. Decades back, she found the place where the ground went from dust to damp to black, where it gleamed at the bottom of her boot print, where she pushed her broad hand into the cool, dark earth and felt it give up moisture against her palm. A spring. A living spring, dammed and buried and forgotten under a season of rock, running yet under the skin of the land, patient, the way the best things are patient, waiting for somebody to finally come and listen. She did not smile. It was too soon to smile. But she sat back on her heels in the cool of that coulee, with the swallows turning overhead. And she let herself breathe all the way down for the first time since the chute, because she understood now exactly what she was holding. and exactly what it was worth, and exactly why a man would burn a ranch to the ground to get it. It took the four of them 3 days with iron bars and a slip scraper to pull the choke of rock out of that channel, working dawn to dark in the kind of fierce quiet that comes over men who know the thing they are doing matters more than their lives. On the third afternoon, the water came not in any grand gush, but in a slow, widening seep that pushed dark down the old stream bed and grew as the land let go of pressure it had held for 30 years, running east along its forgotten course toward the home pasture. The horses smelled it before any man saw it reach them. The led mare threw up her head a quarter-mile off and broke into a trot, and the whole gaunt herd swung and followed her down to drink. Toby whooped. Bartlett took off his hat. Caleb Doran stood apart with his arms crossed and watched his horses put their muzzles into living water, and Della Fenn stood a little behind him and watched him watch them, and she thought about how much a man can carry a dead wife, a dead child, a dying ground, and what it does to him when even one stone of it is finally lifted off. He turned and looked at her. "How'd you know?" he said. She said she hadn't known. She'd only believed she'd seen something, and decided the cost of being wrong was smaller than the cost of saying nothing. He held her gaze a beat longer than the work required, and then Bartlett called from down the wash, and the moment closed, and the water ran on. That should have been the end of the trouble. It was only the middle, because the water meant they had something now, and a man who has something is a man worth ruining outright. Vane came back inside the week, and this time he did not come smiling. He came with a lawyer in a dark coat and a paper, and the paper said that the Doran Ranch carried a second mortgage of $2,000, signed by Caleb Doran 14 months back, now in default, and held by Hollis Vane, and that the whole of Antelope Bench, water and grass and coulee and all, was forfeit, and Doran had 30 days to clear the note, or clear off. Caleb Doran said he had never in his life signed such a note. The lawyer smiled the way lawyers smile, and laid the document on the porch rail, and there at the bottom was Caleb Doran's name, in Caleb Doran's hand, witnessed and notarized and sealed, and dated the 14th of August the year before. Della took the paper up off the rail before anyone could stop her and read it the way she read everything, all the way down, slow, and something in the date snagged at her like a nail in cloth. The 14th of August, the year before. She knew that date. She had no reason to know that date, except that she did, because she had read it, not 3 weeks past in the ranch ledger, in the careful hand of a man recording his griefs as facts. She handed the paper back. She said nothing, but that night she had the ledger open under the lamp, before Caleb had even hung his hat, and she turned it to the page, and she set her finger on the line. On the 14th of August, the year before, Caleb Doran had not been in Cottonwood Forks signing notes in a land agent's office. He had been 90 miles south in Billings, burying his wife and his stillborn son, and the ledger said so in his own ink, and so did the stone over Sarah Doran's grave, and so would the undertaker, and the preacher, and every soul who had stood at that hole in the ground while a dirt-poor county put a good woman in the earth. A man cannot sign a paper in 2 places at once. The forgery was good. The forgery was very good. But the forger had reached for a date out of a dead season and picked, of all the days in the year, the one day his victim could prove down to the hour that he had been somewhere else, weeping. You do not fight such a man with the county sheriff, who shares his pew. The railroad was a thing of the United States, and so was the General Land Office, and a forged conveyance of land sitting in the path of a federal right-of-way was a federal matter. Della wrote the letter herself, in her clean hand, and Whit carried it to the telegraph and then the post, and 3 weeks later, a spare, quiet man named Endicott stepped off the southbound stage, a special agent of the land office, with a leather case and the patient eyes of a man who has caught a great many liars and is in no particular hurry to catch one more. Della laid it before him at the kitchen table the way her father had laid out horses, every piece in its place. The forged note with its damning date, the ledger in Caleb's own hand, the grave register from Billings, the dated sheriff's reports of the spring and the wire and the lamed colt, the doctored feed bills running back to Pruitt's store and Pruitt running back to Vane. She did not raise her voice once. When she was done, Endicott was quiet a long time, turning the forged note in the lamplight. "Ma'am," he said at last, "who taught you to build a case?" She said her father had taught her to build everything she knew how to build, and most of it he'd done with horses. Hollis Vane was arrested at his own supper table 11 days later on a federal charge of forging a land conveyance in the path of a government survey. And once a man like that begins to fall, the men around him fall over themselves to push. Asa Pruitt, looking at the inside of a federal prison, remembered all at once a great many useful things and swore them out against his brother-in-law to save his own neck. The notary remembered being paid. The hired man who'd driven a poisoned coyote up into a spring at midnight remembered the $1 he'd been paid to do it. The note was struck down as the fraud it was. The Doran Ranch was clear, and in the early winter, the railroad's own man rode out to Antelope Bench in a long coat and stood at the lip of Rattlesnake Coulee, watching the only living water for 40 miles run, dark and steady, over the rocks they'd cleared. And he offered Caleb Doran a sum of money for a water stop lease so large that Toby, hearing it, sat straight down in the snow. Doran did not sell the ground. He leased the water and kept the land, the way Della told him to, because a man who owns the well owns the town that grows around it. By the turn of the year, there was a contract signed, and lumber on the way for a proper tank and a sidetrack, and the Doran horses, sound and fat, now on green Coulee grass, were spoken for 2 seasons, out by an army that always needed remounts. It was on a still cold evening near Christmas that the last thing was said, the thing that had been waiting in the house as long as she had. Supper was cleared, the boys gone to the bunkhouse, Bartlett off to the barn the way he went every night. Della came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and found Caleb Doran sitting on the bench in the dark, and she sat down beside him, not across. And the few inches between them stayed a few inches, and neither of them made anything of it. The cattle of the night lay quiet. The water ran somewhere below in the dark, going where it had always meant to go. After a while, he said, "My father told me once that land's only worth as much as the people willing to stay on it." She said his father had been right. He was quiet, and then he set his cup down, and he turned to her, and the fence wire eyes were not cold anymore at all. "I want to say a thing plain," Caleb Doran said, "because I've spent 2 years not saying things, and I've buried enough to know it doesn't pay." He looked at her steady. "The first day you came, I looked at you the way a fool looks at the outside of a thing. The whole county looks at you that way. They see a heavy, plain woman, and they think they've read the whole book off the cover." He shook his head slowly. "I've never in my life met anyone worth more. You saved the colt. You saved the books. You found the water that nobody'd found in 30 years. You saved the whole place, and you did it without once asking to be thanked." His voice dropped. "And somewhere in there, I quit being able to imagine a morning without you in this house. That's not gratitude, Della. I know the difference. I've loved before. I know exactly what this is, and I mean it exactly the way it sounds." She had carried the knowing of it for weeks, carefully, the way she carried everything, afraid that to look at it straight would make it break in her hands. She looked at it straight now. "Say it then," she said, very low, "the way you say everything, plain." "I love you," Caleb Doran said. "I'd be glad and proud to call you my wife." And Della Fenn, who had been told her whole life by every mirror and every man that she was a verdict already passed, felt the cold and the dark and the long road of years fall away from her all at once. And she leaned across those few inches and kissed him, plain and sure, and felt his hand come up careful against her jaw the way she'd seen him, gentle, a frightened colt, and she stayed there in the warm of it, a long, long while. "Yes," she said, when she could. "Plain as that. Yes." They were married in the spring, in the little church in Cottonwood Forks, with the water running and the colt sound and the railroad coming up the valley toward the town that would one day carry the Doran name. And on the day the workmen raised the frame of the new house up on the bench, a good solid house with a wide window facing northeast toward the coulee, built by a man who had thought hard about who it was for Della Fenn, stood in the empty doorway with her hand on the new wood, and she thought of a notice tacked to a freight office wall, and the words, "No letters of character necessary," and what those words had cost her to believe, and what they had finally given her in return. "The window faces the coulee," she said. "So you can always see the water," Caleb said, coming up behind her. "So I can always see where I'm needed," she answered, and she put her broad, strong hand against the frame of her own front door, on land that had chosen her exactly as surely as she had chosen it, And for the first time in 23 years, Della Fenn was not going anywhere, and knew it, all the way down to the bone. The world will hand you a verdict before you've spoken a word, scrawled across the cover of your body or your name, but the cover was never the book. Della found water. Others rode past for 30 years because she did the quiet, faithful work no one was watching. So do yours. Stay where you're needed, lend your strength gladly, and let the right person finally read every page. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, purely to bring you a little entertainment, while passing along a warm and hopeful lesson worth carrying into your own life.